So, welcome everyone to Level Up Together, which is hosted by the AMS Ludomusicology Study Group. I'm co-chair along with James Hazelwood Dale, who I saw pop in just a second ago. Uh,
Yay. Hi,
so,
James.
we really intended this to be focused around the community and allowing us to sort of serve, especially the graduate student and the early career niche that I think, maybe other groups like the SSSMG or NACFIGM more broadly might be a little more sort of at the professional level. But we thought ourselves, what could really serve just not only the community as a whole, but specifically the graduate students, specifically the early career scholars. And so we came up with Level Up Together, which I love the subtitle, what the essential skills they didn't teach you in grad school, right? Or at least I wasn't often taught them in grad school. So maybe some of you out there are lucky and you're like, yeah, this is, we cover this. But a lot of times the things that we're covering will be topics that will just really help develop us professionally and help us succeed in our field. Because when one of us succeeds, we really all do in Ludomusicology. So without further, let me do just a bit of housekeeping before we introduce our guest. Of course, stay on mute, even though this is a meeting, not a webinar, while Dana is presenting, and then in the Q&A, we'll be able to go back and forth. I really want this to sort of be like 30 minutes, Dana presenting, and then the rest of the time, 30, 40-ish, open it up for questions and answers. So to be really driven by the community questions. You can submit your questions using the Q&A tool at the bottom of Zoom. You might have to, I had to dig into a menu to find it, but the Q&A tool, I will be monitoring those, and of course, we'll moderate sort of putting those forward during the Q&A time. So please write those questions into the Q&A and as we go along. So I'll just be collecting those throughout. And of course, you can ask your question live as well. Once it's posted, then you can unmute and speak.
Yeah, and you can throw stuff in chat too. I'm going to have that window up, so I will be able to see stuff in real time as well.
Very good, very good. All right, so without further ado, let's introduce our guest who needs no introduction within the Ludo community. So Dana Plank is an independent scholar whose scholarship works within the realms of disability studies, of video game sound and gender, and is the editor-in-chief of the JSMG, Journal for Sound and Music and Games. Also gave just a really great webinar on the JSMG publication pipeline last week. She was a co-editor of the intersection of animation, video games, and music with Lisa Sculligan, and has a forthcoming edited volume with Michael Austin and Karen Cook on gender and sexuality in video game sound. In addition to the many, many hats that Dana wears, she's on the editing board or the programming board for the NACFIGM conference, as well as Game SoundCon, two of our biggest conferences, which really helps her to speak to this topic today, as well as the video game music stream with Bardic Knowledge, Ryan Thompson's, Julianne Grasso's, and Karen Cook's stream on Thursdays at 9. In addition, a freelance violinist, chamber musician, for weddings and other gigs, arranger, transcriptionist, so just wearing all the different hats that there are to wear. And so let's just give a warm welcome as we turn it over to Dana.
Hello, welcome. Thank you for being here on a Friday afternoon. So a lot of this intro slide we can go very quickly through because who am I and why should you listen to me? A lot of this was in my bio. So I have a PhD in historical musicology with concentrations in Ludo and disability studies. Before, I actually co-chaired both the music and media and Ludomusicology study groups for AMS. And of course, we in that capacity put together sessions, did call for papers, evaluated proposals. One of my many side gigs was as a freelance editor for academic dissertations and theses, where I would line edit, copy edit, proofread, and format everything from undergraduate papers to full manuscripts by PhDs in fields ranging from business to nursing to theoretical physics, not just humanities projects. And I advised clients on how to improve their argumentation, structure, and flow, in addition to helping catch objective errors. And I worked on dozens of abstracts since I began that job in 2016. I am on the board of the North American Conference on Video Game Music, including both serving as a voting member of the programming committee and chairing the program committee and hosting here in 2025. I'm also co-chair of the game studies track of Game SoundCon, an industry-facing conference where Matthew Thompson and I try to bring scholarship on game music into conversation with the practitioners and foster connections between academics and the industry. I have my edited collection with Lisa Scoggin on animation, video games, and music. And the second one, slowly in progress here, with Michael Austin and Karen Cook. Of course, both of which involved soliciting CFPs, as well as approaching some authors directly to participate and evaluating those proposals. I am current editor in chief for the Journal of Sound and Music and Games, and before that, I was peer reviewing for them, as many of us will, trying to provide feedback to those seeking to publish their work. So I view my role there as inherently constructive, even when giving criticism or revise and resubmit requests, for trying to promote rigor while hopefully empowering the author to make the work the best it can be before it goes to print. So therefore, I have sort of an insider view into some of the major venues where you might be looking to present your work. And I've also learned over time to articulate what it is I look for in an abstract, so much that I built an entire workshop on it with a VOD uploaded to YouTube, which was called Wombat, the workshop on much better abstract tactics. Pete Smucker coined that term, and I ran with it, and I just loved that. And I will have a link at the end to a document that will contain kind of an outline of everything here, and all of these links to, so you don't have to go looking those up. So NACWGM, Game SoundCon, all those things will be linked. So I felt I needed a new animal for this iteration, and instead of just doing a redux of Wombat, so I present to you Capybara, the conference abstracts and publications you'll bet are readily accepted. I'm really excited to have a new animal in the backdrop too. So, what stage does my paper need to be in to even submit to a conference? I like telling this story, especially to grad students. I never, never, ever submitted a paper that wasn't already written when I was in grad school. I just felt much more secure proposing things I had already written for seminars. The abstracts are a lot easier to write when the paper already exists and you're merely distilling it down to fit the word count. So it's kind of good practice in learning how to communicate what the content is. Also, a paper for a grad school course has likely seen feedback on a draft or the final version from the professor already, so it's often some of your more polished work. As you get experience in the field, you start developing more intuition about how much initial research is enough for you to have secure footing to write a proposal. But initially, I sort of felt like I wanted to have it set already, because I like to be overly prepared. So my first pro tip is actually download abstracts or markup conference programs when you see them. If you see an abstract and it looks particularly effective to you, really try to break down why that is and take notes on it. And that way you can learn from your peers with real-time examples. I still do this. I'll still like, mark like, ooh, nice, stuff to myself. I really like how they did this, how they phrased it, because we can always keep improving. So one question we get a lot is, can research sort of be, too far along to even like submit? Maybe it's a larger thesis chapter. It's like so big that it's sort of like, how do I fit this into a 20-minute proposal? You may have to make decisions about what to keep to fit into the abstract and into that 20-minute presentation if you have too much work. A larger chapter or something like that, maybe splitting it up into sort of multiple subheading areas and focusing on one or another. I always tell people you can always have the rest at the ready for Q&A. I always save multiple versions if I have a longer paper that I cut down for a conference proposal. I pull stuff into footnotes and then I sort of have it right there for Q&A. You can also just sort of have one that has more of the stuff in it that you're like, okay, I'm going to save that for when I go to publish it. I always say to err on the side of having less, because I think some of the most memorable conference papers in a negative way are those where somebody tries to cram way too much in. They speak a mile a minute and the audience can't keep up. So nobody will retain any of that. You want to leave them wanting more and asking after it and building a connection with you by discussing it with you during the breaks afterward, reaching out over email, continuing the conversation forward. Two main types of abstracts to be aware of. There's the informative abstract that we don't tend to get trained in the humanities, and this is much more common in the sciences and social sciences. And it gives as clearly and simply and directly as possible purpose, method, scope, results, and conclusion of the study. Whereas descriptive, I like to compare it to a book jacket. You're trying to sort of entice your reader with compelling threads without maybe giving things away like a conclusion. It would include purpose, method, and scope and describe the study, but might not present any results. So a descriptive abstract for a conference can be a bit risky because it can make your work look like it's not ready to present yet. So I basically advise for a hybrid of the two and thinking a little more scientifically and direct. Thinking carefully about the language and the wording to sort of pique your reader's interest, like a descriptive abstract, while still giving as much information as possible to show the committee that the work is at a stage to present. There is such thing as work that's not yet ready to go into front of peers, and that's a common reason why something might get rejected. All right. Components of a good abstract. It needs a crystal clear title. It can have something cute in it, like a pun on the title of the game or a play on something relating to the game, but it also needs the informative part that tells you what it's about. So usually the format will be a cute thing, alliteration, pun, and then a colon, and then the informative part of the title. For a conference, you generally put the catchy part first, but for a lot of publications like book titles and chapters and edited collections, you may be advised to flip this. So, for example, the collection by William Gibbons and Stephen Reale was Music in the Role-Playing Game, Heroes and Harmonies. So the alliterative part is after the colon. This has to do with the press's preference for search engine optimization and being able to find your stuff on the topic more easily by having it front-loaded on the title. Having an introduction and thesis statement. This is where I tell you what I like to see. Not that it's the only way to do things, but in general, I want some kind of a strong argument, some kind of a conclusive statement. Things that are too general, particularly I am going to explore statements. They seem like the idea is a little underbaked to me, or it's just not far enough along yet, like because you haven't done the work. You're telling me what you think you will do or what you will plan to do, but you can't always know how the work is going to go until you're in it a little bit. So hook us in by having something to say about your work, not just telling us you will do it. I can't be convinced you'll deliver if you are making predictions about what hasn't happened yet. So the first couple sentences can state a purpose, what problem it solves, an argument you're going to persuade us of, why the reader should be interested, and how much context you give depends on what you're looking at. An obscure indie title might need a very brief intro to what the game is, maybe a genre, game mechanics, barest outline of a plot, although you do not want to let plot descriptions take over your word count. Can you imagine if you're submitting on Kingdom Hearts, for example, and you're trying to explain the plot of Kingdom, like you wouldn't have an abstract at that point. Some games, the plots are pretty convoluted, so that may be an area to save some space. But you may need to give a little bit more for a game people aren't going to know. You may need to give far less if you're giving us a Mario paper or a Zelda paper, especially if it is to a Ludo-informed audience. If I'm proposing to the AMS, though, I might need to consider that some folks may not be gamers at all. So, also showing you know the literature. We've had papers that don't cite the precedent like they should. So, this is a moment to shout out the SSSMG, Society for the Study of Sound and Music and Games, bibliography. So, even a cursory search there should help keep you up on at least who has published on your game or something relating to your game. You can search by keyword and topic and find things that way. You can even look through the NACFGM past conferences section of their site, which uploads generally the abstracts and the program, so you can see who's done things and then kind of follow up from there, see if there's some sort of a YouTube video of it. Some folks consent to having those uploaded permanently, that sort of thing. Next would be methods, methodology. You don't necessarily have to spell this out in any great detail. Major methodological influences can be presented in a word or two, mentioning sort of how you collected your data, if you're doing something a little more empirical. I saw a piece of advice online that I really liked saying that statements about what you did can almost always be replaced or rephrased as statements about your findings. Folks are generally going to be more interested in results, conclusions, or arguments than methods, and you can save a lot of words that way. And of course, results. I always say don't be coy, don't save the good stuff for the paper, because if the committee isn't hooked enough by the abstract, you will not get the chance to wow us. You won't have space to give us everything, but when a paper seems like it has no point, or like it's just in that initial exploratory phase, I'm less likely to vouch for it and accept it. So, with all of those major things in place, examples as space allows, especially if you're looking at a number of different games, you may only have space for one. If the whole paper is kind of centering on a single game, you may not need to give a specific musical example, or may not have as much space for it. But as space allows, you could put a cursory example that gives us a sense of, okay, well, there is something that we're going to apply this to. References. I tend to like seeing them. They are by no means required or expected in every conference or every situation. You can often get by with a few well-placed in-text parenthetical citations to indicate that you've done the legwork. Just a couple major names, Planck 2023, whatever it is, if you're citing something of mine, just to indicate what it might be so that we can have a sense. You can, though, and a lot of conferences are starting to request this, you can have a separate bibliography at the end, which is separate from the abstract and will not count toward your word count. Many conferences are starting to request this just to have a sense that folks have done a little bit of preparation. So usually it's a short bibliography, 2 to 5 sources. Doesn't have to be anything extensive, but that can be nice to just sort of see what they have in the list. Images. Not required or expected. My preference is generally to avoid them unless they are just absolutely vital. I think this is one thing you can usually save for the actual presentation. And extensive transcriptions or musical examples could backfire on you by seeming like a way to try to skirt the word limit because, having captions for what they are, it sort of adds in all this extra material. So be judicious if you're going to use an image in a proposal stage. Finally, very, very importantly, if your research deals with sensitive topics, you should spell this out as clearly as possible with content or trigger warnings. This will not inherently prevent you from being accepted if you're writing on something intense. I've given papers on pornographic video games, as well as disability fetishism, child death, and trauma in the past. But not showing care in presenting the material can give the organizers pause, especially since they are judging these abstracts without knowing who is behind them and if they will handle the material responsibly. So you can sort of indicate that by how well you word those types of statements. And a lot of the time, if a content or trigger warning is right at the top before the actual abstract begins, a lot of folks don't really count that toward the word limit either. So I know, like, I won't necessarily include that. All right, some basic formatting notes. Think about things just being easy on the eyes for your reader. So double spacing is nice. A serif versus a sans serif font. The thought is that sans serifs, without the little flags on them, are better visually on screens, online, etc., and that serifs have a bit more physical presence and weight that's better in print. That's not a hard rule. There are exceptions either way, but either way, pick one that's fairly standard and not distracting. You don't want folks to, notice your Comic Sans proposal. But if you do something like Times New Roman, Calibri, Arial, Garamond, those will tend to not stand out in a bad way. Things like margins don't really matter unless they are unusually large and visually distracting. Leave them default. title, make sure the abstract has one and not some placeholder, and make it very clear. Metadata and anonymity ensure that you don't have any identifying information. So a header with your name on it, your institution, your email, all of that goes in the body of the email with your submission. Paragraph breaks. So in general, most abstracts will be one paragraph, but you may have a couple of very short paragraphs, so you could either indent them or have them unindented and use an extra line break between paragraphs, which is more of a web page look. No one tends to make a fuss about this as long as it looks clean. And then finally, you don't really need page numbers because an abstract is usually at most 2 pages, maybe with a bibliography. You can put them in, but it doesn't really matter. Okay. So, a little bit on some of the specific venues here. So, the North American Conference on Video Game Music process is that abstracts come in. There's a call for papers out right now. And then our program chair will collect them all at the deadline and ensure anonymity, that nobody left in their name at the top of the page. Then they will, after they collect all of them, send out the abstracts, usually all in one document, often with headings to ease navigation when clicking through and reading, along with a scoring sheet. And then each member of the committee can write comments as well as give a score from 1 to 5. 5 being a must see, we need to program this. 1 being I want to reject this. I don't think this should be in the conference. Then we used to just average the committee members' scores and put them in order from highest to lowest and discuss where the cutoff should be. And then we would have an opportunity to advocate or discuss if there was one that really stood out to us but didn't score well. But a few years ago, Pete Smucker was the program chair and calculated standard deviations of our scores to find out which ones we disagreed on most. So, an example being somebody gave it a 5 and another member gave it a 1. And we specifically discussed a swath of abstracts that were kind of in this middle ground or on the cusp to determine the merits of particular proposals, evaluate how they might pair with other papers we plan to accept, and determine what would make the best fit given the finite number of slots on the program. So there are papers every year that I think all of us would love to see that we're unable to accept, and we always hope folks will resubmit to another conference or try again, or try to get it in print, or that we'll get to see it in some form. So we all have some biases here. I had really bad conservatory theory, so I can get a little lost in the weeds of theory papers, and I'll look to the theorists on the committee to evaluate if the methodology is sound. I'm a sucker for non-canonic stuff like indie games because I just don't want us as a field to focus too narrowly on Kondo and Uematsu. But this is why we have multiple people evaluating, because everybody's going to have different things that stand out to them and that they look for. And then our conversation can really help us get to really strong program. And I think the past few years we've had just really excellent papers across the board. So I wanted to give just a couple examples of comments from the NACVGM sheets, anonymized as well as I can. So you won't know who they're relating to, but these are comments from the committee members on things that scored extremely low were generally at the bottom of the pile. So things like, this proposal doesn't seem to be aware of the large amount of existing work on immersion in video games. That's a big one. Hashtag cite literally anyone. I fundamentally disagree with this central idea. Okay. More common, feels a bit naive, a beginning attempt, but one that needs developing before it's ready to present. That's a good one. This is a big one. There's no takeaway here, and the premise is stale to me. That's interesting. And then an example here, not a single video game is mentioned. I feel like this person doesn't have a single example in mind. Good premise, confusing abstract. So in that case, they spent a lot of time talking about their methodology and they didn't actually point to any example. So that was rough. So let's see what else. There was one, this feels manageable and focused in scope, but I'm extremely wary considering controversial composer's name here is spelled incorrectly. Oof, do your proofreading. Major scholar, conspicuously absent from bibliography, stuff like this. And errors. This is not how the music in this game is implemented. Premise is flawed, right? Wasted time in the abstract discussing transcription process and didn't really get into the methodology they were going to talk about. Wasn't where it needed to be, etc. Lots of examples here. But you can see a lot of them boil down to things like not having a clear purpose, having us not really follow what it was going to be about, lacking in detail, having objective errors, those kinds of things. Game Sound Con. Oh, there we go. So GameSoundCon is not anonymous. Between Matthew Thompson and I, we can see the names and full contact info of every proposal. This is set by Brian Schmidt for the whole conference, not exclusive to our track. In the industry, personality and presentation style really matters, and Brian wants substance in the talk so it doesn't read as just a big marketing fest for whatever game somebody has most recently worked on. So Brian has set this so Matt and I can see identifying info for every talk, not just the ones submitted to our track. We do grab stuff from the broader pool of submitted talks sometimes if we feel like one will fit better for ours and the other track chair doesn't mind giving it to us. So we do sometimes trade talks to other panels as well. So in a case of tailoring to the conference, I think one useful thing is Matthew in particular does not like to see something that we just saw at NAC VGM redone and submitted with no changes to GameSoundCon. So in general, you will be able to give the same paper twice in multiple venues because the audiences are different. So this is a good exception to be aware of that this isn't the case presenting at, say, NACFGM and then Ludo, or NACFGM, then music and the moving image, or something like that. This is just a personal preference. It's not that we'll never take one that's a redux from NACFGM, but Matthew will prefer newer work that from somebody else than something he's seen before. All right. Another big one with this one is to think about the industry professional audience. Don't be quite as esoteric. Work on modern games is a plus because the people who worked on it could be there and you could meet them. So those are things that we also like to consider for GameSoundCon. And then since we know who people are, we can take into account the personality, who's an excellent presenter. So if we've seen you before and we're like, oh, Jordan Stokes gives an amazing presentation, and we saw Jordan put in a good abstract, then we could go, yeah, we're pretty sure that's going to be a solid talk. So we have the ability to do that more than we would when things are anonymous and we don't know who's behind it. All right. So a person who's a good presenter won't get in if the abstract is terrible, but there is a trust if the abstract seems pretty promising, that, the presentation style can matter. Okay. And folks can ask me, I do have examples of some of my notes on game sound con rejections, but they're pretty similar to the NACFGM. All right. Finally, edited collections also don't tend to be anonymous, kind of like GameSoundCon. There may be a call for papers circulated by the editor or editors, but it also might be totally curated. So you could just be asked by an editor directly to contribute instead of having to submit, and that'll save a step. You'll still have to write the abstract, though, for the book, but they may come to you at a conference and say, hey, your work seems kind of promising, or do you have anything that might fit this book we're going to do? So most of the time you'll get asked more directly, but you may see a call for papers. Editors are trying to create a certain organization to the collection. So the most important thing to be aware of here is really fit the brief. So my animation book was animation, video games, and music. We needed all three of those represented in the proposal versus just having a game music paper. And we did have several people do kind of just typical Ludo video game and music. And we're like, we really need it to tie into an animation piece in some way. So those were the talks that the papers that we privileged here. So this, for edited collections, this really shows the importance of networking, being present in the community, presenting at conferences, so you're on the radar of folks as they get a book under contract to even ask you, which isn't to say you will never send something kind of anonymously, that maybe they haven't heard of you before. You can definitely get in that way, but relationships can help here. Okay. Just a little bit more and we'll open it up. Some simple tips and tricks, and there's more of these, more detail on all of this in Wombat. Use active voice because passive voice tends to have longer sentence constructions. It's more direct. It saves words to use active voice. Be consistent on tense. You basically just don't want things to read awkwardly or for somebody to kind of stumble over it. So if you're switching tenses, if your number agreement is off because you didn't proofread, things like that can come across as really awkward. Draft the abstract first, then worry about cutting it down for word count. So start larger than you need and then cut. Read your abstract out loud to yourself is my number one for everything. Because when you read in your head, you often skip over errors, but saying it out loud has a way of helping you catch the little things, slow down a little bit, also improve the flow, and make sure you're varying your prose enough in terms of sentence structure and avoiding redundant phrases. I recommend this for all writing, and I have told people, and it's true. I did this for my entire 360-page dissertation right before my defense because it helped me catch everything, all those like last errors that I could correct. And then also it was excellent prep for my defense. So even in large form works, reading aloud is really great. You can often eliminate things like adverbs and adjectives and just keep the prose a little more direct and simple, save the more stylized stuff for the paper itself. Avoid things like ellipses or incomplete sentences, especially at the end where it feels like you just cut off in the middle of a sentence. That does happen where somebody maybe didn't copy and paste properly, and we're missing the end of it. Avoid acronyms. You'll want to spell them out on first usage, and specialized jargon, but you can know your audience here when it comes to terminology. If you're proposing to the AMS, you might want to spell out Nintendo Entertainment System, but for NACVGM, you could get by with NES, and we know that one. Gerunds are your friend, the ing forms of a verb versus an infinitive, because, to go versus going, you're saving a word. So that's a good way to cut one word at a time if you're really close to having the amount you need. So finally, your paper can still change course as you're working on it. This is a really common question. What happens if sometimes the best stuff comes a bit later in the process. A new source comes your way that changes your direction. Your analysis reveals something really unique and novel and interesting. That's okay and expected and very normal. Very few people will even notice if you change course a bit from the abstract, as long as the talk itself is really solid. Folks won't be like, "Well, you said you were going to talk about this." They're going to deal with what's in front of them. But it never hurts to be really prepared on that front end and sort of have a good sense of where you're going until you get a better sense for when something is far enough along to be presented for feedback. So it is okay for things to change. Obviously, you wouldn't want to give a totally different paper than what was accepted. That's disingenuous. But for the paper itself to change directions, or, I sort of said this was going to be the thing, but this was sort of what I concluded in the process. That's normal. That's normal. All right. Finally, common mistakes, proposal killers. We've alluded to these all throughout, but one huge one, failing to anonymize the abstract, especially if it's a PDF and it's harder to go back in and edit. The chair could just elect to automatically throw it out because you didn't follow the instructions. So make sure you follow the instructions of the call for papers. Only put identifying info in the body of the submission email, and they'll usually show you what they're looking for there. And then finally, things like not stating a thesis or a conclusion. Where's the so what? Why should I care? What is this actually doing? How is this contributing in some way? And then finally, probably one of the more common ones is not citing what kind of Ludo literature you're going to draw on for this. So making sure that you are connecting back to the field in some way that you have read a little bit. You don't have to be aware of every single thing, but there are major lacunae that will be noticed by the committee. All right, from there, I have plenty more material that we can get into, but I'd love to just move into questions instead.
All right, thank you very much for that presentation, Dana. So I'll take my chair's privilege here to ask the first question while we give some time for the others to submit in questions, and I think we have plenty of time to field a lot of these. So I guess for my prepared question, I would just ask you to kind of expand on one of the points that you ended on, which was how would you recommend navigating making a proposal that would account for possible changes in the direction of your research or findings and conclusion as you develop your analysis. Like we want to have that sort of and that enticing, powerful conclusion stated, but it also could change as the research develops.
Yeah. I'm sort of thinking through. Honestly, like I don't worry too much about about that. As long as I'm still working in the same topic area, I could even kind of contradict my thesis because sometimes things come up. I think you just have to acknowledge it in the paper itself. That originally, this was what I thought was happening, and then I kind of dug under the hood and like I determined this, or I met the composer and I actually talked to them, and they actually told me what was going on, and it wasn't what I had hypothesized. Things like that totally happen. They've happened to me, where I was able to meet a person, and like I had found back when I did my Paul Webb score for Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, the adaptation of the movie for the NES. I hadn't found any like interviews with him or anything like that, especially relating to the sound and the music. I had found some reviews of the game, nothing focused on the music and how different it was from the film. After I wrote the abstract, though, I ended up tracking down Paul Webb and interviewing him in depth. So I was able to ask a lot of questions, learn about his love of Thomas Tallis, and kind of confirm some of the things that I was working on, which shaped the resultant paper, where I was sort of speaking to, particularly drawing on Renaissance sound instead of medieval for this Robin Hood story. Um, but early on, I was still recognizing that I was hearing sort of an early music sound. So I have references to that in the abstract. Um, I mentioned that things like ground or limit bass lines that were easily looped, meters that were regular and thus easier to encode than Gregorian chant. Limited number of sound channels on the console was more conducive to textures found in Renaissance polyphony. So I was able to cite all of those things, saying, I have a sense that this composer had a pretty big interest in early music, and I did confirm that. So I think your analytical skill can set you on a good path. And even if they say, "Oh no, I don't listen to that stuff," um, you know, your ear and your reception of it is going to be different than somebody that works on it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing if you do hear that in it. It doesn't mean that you need to throw the entire work out, right? So I don't know. I'm kind of roundabout speaking to your question.
All right. Well, we like to have a Hugo unmute and ask your first one.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Hi.
Hi.
So my question, you kind of mentioned it, but I wanted to be sure that I understood well about an abstract being refused, let's say, for example, on Night Vigil this year. Can I resubmit it next year? And of course, with improvements, because if it was rejected, it needs. But do you have advices on the best way to do it? And should we acknowledge like that we submitted next year and we are resubmitting this year?
That's a great question. I think for the most part, we see so many abstracts. I don't know that we necessarily would even clock it. Sometimes we might say, "Oh, I think we saw this one before," but certainly if somebody has done further work on it, maybe has had an advisor or a faculty member or a respected peer help them work it up again. We certainly don't mind a resubmission at all. I don't think you necessarily need to acknowledge it. So that said, one thing that has happened in the past, especially when it's a student, maybe somebody that hasn't submitted before, they have asked the program chair to get feedback from the members of the committee. And this isn't common, but it happens from time to time where the chair will come back to us and say, "Hey, X student, proposal number 16 or whatever, wanted some feedback. They're a student. They wanted to hear sort of your take on how it could be improved." And a lot of us will, at least two or three of us on the committee, will take some time to like write up a paragraph explaining our feedback, and we try to do so really thoughtfully and constructively and kindly. And sometimes sometimes in there I'll say things like, there's nothing wrong with your abstract, because the fact of the matter is that we get so many more proposals than we can ever program, just about every year. So there are times where I go, it was just kind of luck of the draw and the way the cookie crumbled. I actually really liked this abstract, and I'd encourage you to submit it elsewhere, right? So sometimes there's nothing wrong with the abstract, but yeah, definitely you can resubmit.
All right, can we do Bridget's question? Would you like to unmute and answer and ask?
Sure. Hi. So this might, I said in the Q&A, this might be a bit of a silly question, but for submissions that do require both an abstract and a bibliography, are they expecting you to put like the game as part of the bibliography or just the literature?
Oh, that's a good question. Generally, we're going to look more at the literature cited. That said, a lot of folks will have like a short ludography with any
Mm.
games mentioned. If it's only one game because it's a case study, generally I don't see that in there, or it will just be thrown in the main bibliography. If you have enough examples of games that you're going to make a separate ludography, sometimes you can see that as well. And there's really no preference there. The committee is good with any and all.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, I might ask another while we're sort of vamping for some more questions, so keep them coming, everyone. Oh yeah, I do see a hand from James. Well, okay, I'll ask mine quickly, and then we'll see where we go from there. So I was just wondering about the balance of citing specific examples that you're going to analyze in the abstract. Obviously, you don't want it to take up like the whole body of your abstract, but how much specificity does it help to have in saying, I want to analyze this example, and this example, and then I think I'll find and include the conclusion from that. You don't want to have no examples, but how many or how much of the space of the abstract does it help to take up by just dialoguing with your examples ahead of time?
Yeah, so this is actually a good moment. I linked my outline document with useful links and abstract examples. So I'm going to transfer my share over to this screen for a moment. And then we can kind of go from there. Let's see, copy. There we go. Oh, that's not it. That's a recipe file. Stop share. That's fine. Copying down recipes. All right. Copy right there. Okay. So I have useful links that I mentioned in the course of the talk, redux of everything said. And then I have some example abstracts. This is taken right out of that Wombat workshop, so I didn't really go over them again here. But here's an example of Pete Smucker's. It's now published, but this was when he proposed it for NACVGM, sound effects of alcohol in video games. So spends the first paragraph kind of situating the literature, and then talks about the kind of four areas of inquiry into the sonic representations. But then at the end, notice he just kind of crams in, here's some of the stuff I'm going to look at. Doesn't go into great detail, doesn't have to give us an unpacked example. But that's one way that we're being walked through what everything is going to be included. So like BioShock, Red Dead Redemption, Final Fantasy franchise, Warner Brothers cartoon High Note, World of Warcraft, 2017 ad for Busch beer. So that was fine. That gave us a sense that it was pretty far along, and because this was more of a framework for looking at this type of sound, like we had a lot of examples as opposed to it being a single game case study like Karen Cook's example here from Fizanity, which has also been published. It's awesome. I really love the resulting publication from this one. One thing to note here is Karen is citing herself here, but when she's putting in for the conference, you have to anonymize. So you can't just be like, see my earlier work, 2019, right? So that's something you can do is just kind of anonymize it, use third person. But here, we're talking about one game. So the examples are all kind of in the second paragraph again here, and we're saying specific things from the game that we're pointing out are interesting about the music. Mode mixture, chromatic melodies, avoiding stasis and looped themes, all those things. So because that's a focus on a single game, the examples can be a little more unpacked. So it does depend on what you're doing. Julianne wrote on Journey here. So again, marks several aspects of what's happening in the sound. and the music. So these examples are all good, and I made sure that my comments here on the side, they're like marked up so you can see exactly what I think is good about all of these.
All right, thank you very much. I think I saw James. You had a hand up.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Hi.
Hi, Dana. Awesome. Thank you so much for this. I'm a little sad that you've moved on from wombat, mammal from my country, but capybara seems like a fantastic next step. So anyway, but this is all really really wonderful and informative. Thank you. So I'm wondering.
It was almost alpaca, I'll have you know.
Oh,
So
nice.
I was like, and Julianne Gresso was like, we're gonna have a whole zoo. Just every workship you give, you need a new animal. So I'm like, okay, challenge accepted. Anyway, go ahead.
Nice, that's fantastic. Yeah, so this is all fantastic, and I'm interested in abstracts.
Hmm.
Uh, and So I currently, this is something you haven't, just because of the time, you haven't necessarily talked about this, but book proposals.
Hmm.
I'm noticing because I'm right now going through some book proposals, finish the dissertation. And I'm noticing that book proposals often want abstracts of all the chapters. Sometimes they want
Hmm.
a full chapter, which is fine.
Yes.
But I sort of wonder with a book. I know it's likely people would have written most of the book, but sure, it's a situation where a lot of the book hasn't been written. And so I'm
Hmm.
wondering about this comment that, the abstract's stronger if you sort of know what you're talking about and you've written the paper. I think that's such great advice. But what if you do, what do you do in terms of books? And then I'm also thinking about your experience editing with Lisa, the animations, music, games. Did you notice there was a difference in terms of how the abstract sort of had to be presented versus Gismug versus Ludo versus Natbigum. So just wondering about abstracts for the sort of like larger projects as opposed to conference papers.
Yeah, let me pull up. I unshared here so that I can reshare. I'll show you our actual proposal for that animation book. And so one thing that you can do first is, of course, ask anybody you know if they're willing to share a copy of what they used. And the press may have certain things that they ask you to include. So of course you have to have a provisional title. It can change. So we had the informative part. We added making movement sing pretty late in the process. Our subtitle. They want a summary. And they want to have a really strong sense in a book. They care a lot about the sort of marketing angle. So they want to know what else has been done that is anywhere near what you're doing here. So you do have to make a point about like, maybe people have looked at animation in video games, but from an art perspective, and nobody's considered the music or something like that. Here's existing work relating to gender and sexuality in video games, but again, not considering the music and the sound. That we had that in our other proposal. So we had our call for papers, which had some similarities to the actual summary of what was going to be in the book. We had a sense of some of the types of papers that we might try to solicit. We brought up Cuphead, Kingdom Hearts, the old Sonic TV show. We didn't get anything on that. Ni no Kuni, Dragon's Lair. So we ended up kind of putting that stuff in. I actually did the Dragon's Lair chapter because nobody gave us an abstract for it. And so we sort of felt that should be in there in one way or another as kind of a precursor to like a Cuphead. So that I basically chose what to write based on what we still needed in the book. So what else do we have? And then we even said that, we were aiming for 6,000 to 8,000 words, all our info here. We had our notes. So this wasn't the one we submitted, but these were like the notes that we had from Neil because we had asked Neil about it. And he mentioned having the objective description first and then the part after the colon being more punny or silly because of the SEO. The rationale, basically, why should this book, why this book? Timetable, they know that things can change, but they want to have a sense of your organization. Your proposed list of chapters, which if it's a solo monograph, obviously you're going to kind of have a sense of what some of those will be. And then they may also ask you for things like a description of the target market, who will want to buy this book, who might assign it for classes, things like that. And then market assessment and competing volumes. You'll want to describe competing volumes and explain how your book will be different and stand out and allow them to market it. So to sort of answer your question, I think there's plenty of space for you to not know what all the chapters are going to be, but you should have a sense of what some of your major ones are. Um, so I'm working on my proposal right now for my final, at long last, version of my like dissertation redux, the Disability and Game Sound book, where I sort of knew I wanted the same premise from the dissertation, but I'm throwing most of the dissertation out and doing new things. And so like I already know this talk I'm giving at Game Sound Con next week on Hellblade and trauma is one of my central case studies chapters. I'm going to do a whole chapter on trauma studies, and so like that's one of them. My That Dragon Cancer work that I've presented a couple different times is also going to be for this book. So I think before you even get to the point of proposing to the press that you want to do a monograph, like having some of that under your belt from conference stuff and sort of holding it back and saying, I'm going to save this for my book and not give it to somebody else, that gives you a place to start from. So often they'll want to see at least 2 sample chapters and a loose outline of everything else. But with recognition that it could change, you might add something in, you might take something out. So I think there is space to do that.
All right, next we have a question from Jasper.
Can't see my comments on the shared doc. Let me make sure that those are visible.
Jasper, did you want to unmute and ask your question? Otherwise, I can just read it. Oh, okay, there, Jasper.
Hi, sorry. So first of all, thank you for hosting this. This is super helpful. So my question is, so I'm working on a grant proposal right now, and a lot of the stuff you've talked about for the abstract was really helpful, but I was wondering if you have any other tips for writing a grant proposal to support a thesis that hasn't even been written yet.
A grant proposal. Well, the thing with grant proposals is that while there are ones that are going to be sort of musicology specific or music theory specific, a lot of times you might be applying for a sort of university-wide fellowship where you're not just competing against other music scholars like the AMS 50. You might be trying to compete against people, in the agricultural sciences, right, or foreign language studies, people from anything. And so it can be really hard to have a sense of what's going to stand out to that crowd. So that's a case where I really look up who has actually won this in the past several years, maybe 5 to 10, as far as you can go back and find them. Often they will be uploaded. And so you'll be able to find the abstract that they used and sort of glean that, just like you're marking up a conference program, like what do I see here? What are they giving? What's really effective? And one thing that can be a problem when you're applying for these kind of general pools of money, which are shrinking in many places and harder to get a hold of in general, is that they are going to kind of privilege things like the sciences if they feel like there is some kind of tangible, immediate benefit to the public, to health practice and things like that. It can feel sort of hard for a humanities project to feel as vital in face of that. And so really trying to think about like, does my angle have some kind of a political praxis? Like what are the applications of this? How might this inform teaching and pedagogical practice, engagement with the public, those kinds of things. How is my work going to get outside of the ivory tower and matter? And if you don't have a strong sense of that, or you're feeling like too shy about it, you need to find the angle, right? Like that's the only way it's going to stand out.
All right, I think we have a second question from Hugo. Quick one, looks like.
Yeah, so it's a very short and naive one, but it's like a method. In English, should we write with using I or we? In French, we have that weird practice when we use we for ourselves. Is it the same in English?
That's actually a wonderful question, Hugo. So, generally, we will indicate that there could be a co-author to us. So, first person singular would be preferred if, as long as it's just you. But if you, otherwise, we're going, is there another author that's not being disclosed? Sometimes we even get this at the journal. Something will get almost to publication, and suddenly there's a co-author we didn't know about. We're having to account for them and make sure they have a signed author agreement and all of these things. So yeah, that can be a signal in when you're doing stuff in English. So yeah, you can definitely use we if you're doing a collaborative project, but otherwise stick to the singular. That's a great question.
Well, and then if I could jump off of that, like, what would you even think about sort of that use of first person I in a abstract proposal? Like, sometimes it's unavoidable, but in general, do you think that's something to keep relatively limited in the proposal?
To keep the sorry, say that one more time.
The use of first person I
Oh,
mean,
the
I
use
know
of first person.
we
It
do that
doesn't
a lot
bother me.
in the body of our published writing, but what about in the proposal, I guess?
Oh yeah, it doesn't bother me. I think it can read as a little bit informal, maybe too casual or colloquial, but it really depends on the sort of the tone of the writing as a whole. So I don't think on its own it will be a problem. But if everything feels kind of too general and casual, then it may count against you. But a really well written proposal that uses first person, uh, like I won't even clock it. And most of the time, it saves a lot of space. You know, you're writing the author or something that's clunky. It's more passive. I is very clear, so I'm all for accessibility and clarity. So I wouldn't say to avoid it.
Alrighty, well, that actually is all the questions I have in the queue, so I should check one last time. Do we have any other burning questions that folks have on the topic of conference proposals and book proposals or book chapter proposals? All right. Going once. I think we did a pretty good job here.
All right. And if anybody has further questions or wants to, work something up for the Journal of Sound and Music and Games, we are always looking to add to the pipeline. So feel free to email. Oops, I didn't mean to direct message that. Meant to send that to everybody. There we go. Feel free to email me, danamblank@gmail.com.
And remember, we have the NACVIGM call for papers out presently.
Yeah.
What is that deadline, Dana, again?
I don't remember.
October.
End of November, maybe? I don't.
November 3rd. Okay, let me look at it.
I'm just trying to get through the next 2 weeks with Game Sound Con and
I
then
know.
immediately going to AMS. So my brain's a little fried on NACVIGM at the moment. So maybe somebody can correct me in the chat.
I'm like, I posted the CFP to the Ludo Discord, so I should know. Oh, actually, Kate did. November 21st. That's sooner than I thought. Okay, so
Before Thanksgiving. So yeah, coming up.
Plus the Mamie call for papers just went up too. That's December 15th. And there's always a nice Ludo contingent that goes to Mamie as well.
Yeah, that's a wonderful, wonderful space. And then generally, Game Sound Con is in the spring into the early summer is when you'll see that call for paper circulated. I recommend only come if you're presenting. It's an industry conference, so it's more expensive than an academic conference. But if you're presenting, you don't get charged the attendance fee. So because you're a speaker, so you basically get into the conference for free, and it's just the travel and the lodging that you'll have to cover for that. So I always tell folks it's a good experience I want you all to have, but do it when you're talking. Don't just pay the $1,000 or whatever it is.
All right, and with that, I think we'll go ahead and bring our first session to a close, although I'll stop recording, and of course we can hang around more after
Wait.
wants to. Wait.
I had to have our close here. Thank you for your kind attention to the capybara. Okay.
Excellent. And we will be having our second level up together of the season on audio and digital audio workstation skills for Ludomusicologists. That will be headed up by Greg Rossetti. We'll have that after AMS, but before Thanksgiving. So somewhere in the mid-November. So keep an eye out for level 2 of Level Up Together. All right, thank you so much, everyone, for attending.
Yeah, absolutely. Reach out anytime.